Okay, we're now recording.
All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this call and this meeting of the Citizens Commission. It's been a year since our first meeting. May 3, I think, was our first meeting, so a year has transpired. I'm going to spend a minute just on logistics and so forth so that everyone can understand what we're trying to do. We have two connectivity mechanisms. The commissioners are connected and listed as panelists. So they're connected through a webinar type mechanism and they're listed as panelists. So commissioners can share video, they have privileges to share video and audio. The public is connecting through a Zoom mechanism. The public is identified as attendees. Currently there's 16. There are restrictions and controls on attendees' ability to share video and audio. As I go through the agenda and further describe in a minute, when we're asking the public to share either video or audio, we'll ask you to either raise your hand or do a chat or pose a question, and we'll recognize you and share the privileges for audio and visual video. The reason that we're doing this is to have a higher level of security and avoid the very disruptive and distasteful interruption that we had on our last call. So that's purely the only reason that we're taking this mechanism is to enhance our ability to avoid that, that type of situation. Now our agenda for tonight is in 8 parts. First is I'll go through for introductions and establish a quorum, and that will be for the commissioners only. Second is we will review and take a motion to approve the minutes. Likewise, that will be for the commissioners. The third topic will be a motion and followed by discussion of draft language on amendment number 1. In addition to the commissioners having audio and visual video privileges, that will also be an opportunity for the public to participate in the discussion of that motion. And so, and use that mechanism I referred to before of raising your hand or putting a chat if you want to comment as we're going through agenda item number 3. Agenda item number 4 will be a motion followed by a discussion on amendment number 2. So again, that will be all the commissioners plus anybody of the public who chooses to participate in that discussion. And again, the public does that by a chat or by raising your hand. Agenda topic number 5 is a report from the working committee on a strategy on advancing the adoption of an amendment. That will actually be a short PowerPoint. I'll take 5 minutes on behalf of the working group, and I'll show everybody what's in the PowerPoint, and then suggest that that become the focus of further action at the next meeting. Agenda item number 6 will be any other public testimony that remains, having already done the previous 5 agenda topics. Agenda item number 7 will be other business of the commission, and specifically time and place for our next call. And then agenda item number 8 will be a motion to adjourn. Again, that's just the commissioners. Any questions or comments about how we're going to run this call? Other members of the commission, we have, are we clear how we're going to do this?
Yeah, let's just do a roll call, Bill.
Okay, so I'm going to go right into it. So I'm going to ask people to, I'm going to literally go down the list and ask you to identify yourself, and we'll establish a quorum. So this is Bill Kilmartin from Wakefield. Costas?
Costas Panagopoulos from Wellesley.
Jeff?
Jeff Clements from Cambridge.
Carmen?
Carmen Chantal from Sudbury.
Bopa?
Bopa Malone from Bedford.
Dominic?
This is Dominic Pangallo from Salem.
Scott? Scott, you're in mute. Scott McDermott? Let's move on to Jay.
Jay Marsden from Holliston.
Okay, so we have a sufficient number to establish a quorum. Next item of business is review and approval of the minutes. Jeff, perhaps you can share your screen with the minutes, and then I'll entertain a motion.
Hey, this is Dominic. I'd like to make a motion to approve the minutes.
Do we have a second?
Second, Jay.
Okay, these are the minutes in front of us. Do other commissioners have anything to discuss as it pertains to these minutes? Okay, hearing no objection, I'll ask for a vote. Since we're doing this remote, we need to do this by roll call. You can stop sharing now, Jeff. Bill Kilmartin, yes. Costas?
Yes.
Jeff?
Yes.
Carmen?
Yes.
Bopa?
Yes.
Dominic?
Yes.
Jay?
Yes.
Scott? Scott was on and appears to be now disconnected.
He's back and he's in as a panelist. I'm gonna just promote him again to a panelist.
Oh, thank you.
He should be back on now.
Hey, Scott, so we just took a vote to approve the minutes. How do you vote?
Is there something I have to do to approve his audio once he's moved in as a panelist?
No, his audio is automatic.
So it's on his end then? He's got to.
Yeah, I'm looking. He's allowed.
Yeah.
Oh, there's no mute button, which means, here it goes, unmute. Here we go.
Oops. Great. Scott, can you hear us now?
He says he's unmuted.
Yeah.
Well, we have the necessary quorum and vote, so why don't we move on, okay? And hopefully, oh, there's
Oh,
Scott.
there he is.
Oh, we can see him now. Can we hear him? Scott?
Must be a slow internet in Medfield.
Well, it says connecting to audio, so let's give that a minute, but we can go on. He's connecting. He's in the process.
Okay, the third topic on our agenda is proposed language for what we're nicknaming Amendment Number 1. This is a straw man language developed by the working group. It was discussed and we took the sense of the group on the previous call. We put it on the table for additional consideration. And so to move forward on this, what we're going to do is I'd ask for a motion, a second, and then we get into discussion to either amend or further change the draft language. So do we have a motion pertaining to what we're calling Amendment Number 1?
I move that we approve Amendment Number 1.
Do we have a second?
Second.
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 Okay, so now we're going to have discussion. In addition to the commissioners, this is also an opportunity for the public to participate in the discussion about this amendment. They will do that, as I described before, by raising their hand. They can do that in the chat window, or they can do that by asking a question. And we'll take as many members of the public that choose to speak in this matter, in which take people in the order in which they present themselves.
We have
Let me
two.
stop. Go ahead, Greg.
Do you want to do the public first, or do you want to do the commissioners first?
Let's do the commissioners first. So we have a motion that's been seconded. You've seen the draft language. Further discussion?
So Matt is not yet on the call. Do we know if he was going to join us tonight? Matthew McKnight?
Matt sent me a text just now asking for the Zoom link. I forwarded it to him by text, so hopefully he's joining us. I don't,
There is someone named Matt here on the side. That might be Matt.
yeah, you want to check, Greg?
Yeah, let me ask. I'm promoting whoever this is to a panelist. Matt, who is this, Matt?
Yeah, I'm on now. Thank you. I
Oh,
couldn't get in.
good.
Okay.
Matt, let me explain the logistics here so we get you up to speed. We have two methods to communicate. The commissioners are communicating through a webinar mechanism, meaning that all commissioners have full privileges to share audio and video. The public is connected through a Zoom mechanism. They only have privileges to do audio or video when specifically granted. And of course, we're doing this to hopefully avoid the type of disruption that we had in the last call. So we went through the quorum. We have a quorum. We went through the minutes. We've approved the minutes. We've had a motion now pertaining to the straw man language on what we're calling amendment number 1. The motion's been made, it's been seconded. We're now going to have discussion. And during this discussion, it'll be any member of the commission, as well as we'll allow the public join during the discussion of this topic. And that's exactly at the moment that we're hoping you to join, and you did. So now what I'm calling for is, a motion has been made, has been seconded, and a discussion about the motion pertaining to the draft language on amendment 1. I know, Matt, you've sent around some suggestions. So
Yeah. So I noticed in the chat some folks want to make comment. I don't know how you want to run the process, Bill. I think there's probably 2 or 3 issues, it sounds like, for discussion. One is the general one that we've been receiving a lot of emails about vis-a-vis 1 or 2 amendments. Also the level of fidelity at which we're addressing certain specific concerns. And then the one that I was raising a specific concern about is the generality of the language, specifically around the word influence in the original working group's recommendation. So I'm happy to talk, super happy to talk to folks about any of those, but maybe I'll pause there and get some guidance from you on how to proceed.
yeah, I'd like the commissioners to go first, and then we'll take every member of the public who chooses to participate in the discussion. But I'd like to do the commissioners first.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just say 2 things. I think one, I share the opinion that we have all discussed for close to a year now, that we have a situation where there is a undue influence of money in politics. I think we've seen significant feedback from our community, and also obviously all of us are here for that reason. I also think that we all see and have seen a significant concern and evidence of non-natural persons having undue influence over the political process, and something that we're all concerned about. So I don't stand here to equivocate on any of those components. My specific concern about the proposed language, maybe 2 things, but primarily was I'm a history major, and I've watched people's view of words, and even in this day and age, view of words that were written in the original Constitution changed differently and interpreted differently over many, many years. And I just want to be very, very careful that we think about the implications of the words we're using in the context of both how future generations will view them, how we would see them today, be very blunt about it. Would we interpret them differently if there was a Republican president and a Republican Congress versus a Democratic president and Democratic Congress? Those 2 different things are litmus tests for me as to whether the language can last for hundreds of years versus being an answer for the moment. And in particular, the word influence is a word that is a very broad and not legally specific term. And I have specific thoughts on it, but I wanted to make sure that we were thinking through that as a group and as a community before we propose that as language.
Are you suggesting an amendment to the draft language?
I'm not sure, maybe say, what's the motion again?
It's the language that you see on the screen.
Yeah, I'm not, I don't know what the question is, but I am not supportive of the draft language, to be direct about it. Whatever the specific thing I should say, you can tell me.
Okay. Are there other commissioners that want to discuss the motion?
Yes, I'd like to discuss the motion.
Recognizing Colin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think that the language that we come up with that's the subject of this motion is pretty clean and straightforward. And the one aspect of it that's important to understand is that it doesn't complete the mandate of our commission. It does not speak to corporations or juridical entities as not having the same rights as human beings. The subcommittee that drafted this decided to have two amendments put forth. This amendment and another amendment, the other amendment speaking to juridical persons, non-human beings not having the same inalienable rights as people. And the reason for us breaking it into two amendments rather than one was the belief that the overriding concern of the people, of the voters who voted for this ballot question, set us up. Their overriding concern was to see that money, the corrupting influence of money, be taken out of the electoral process. This draft amendment that we're looking at right now recognizes that the Congress would give Congress the ability to regulate spending on spending by individuals and spending by corporations, spending by juridical persons on elections and ballot questions, and similarly gives the power to the legislatures to make similarly decide and regulate spending on state races in their states. And I think it's really very, very straightforward. I like the language. Influence is when courts interpret language, they first look to the plain meaning of a word. When they look in the dictionary, look in the Webster's Dictionary, Oxford English Dictionary, and then if the word has been accorded some other special meaning, that might be brought up. But normally words have their plain and obvious meaning. So I like this, I think this amendment works. I think it works because most of the American people, most of the people in Massachusetts that are anxious to have an amendment to undo the harm that Citizens United did, are concerned with getting big money out of politics, stopping the corrupting influence of money on our politics, on our elections specifically. And I think, this does it. This does it. If we bring in, so I'm very much in favor of this language, and not only to achieve the end of getting the money out of politics, but also recognizing that by separating the other issue of non-juridical persons not having the same rights as natural persons, we're removing that so that this amendment that we're looking at right now is simpler and straightforward, and most people can grasp it, and I think they'll get behind it. Versus if we put it all together, it will be a much heavier lift, and we need to get the money out of politics sooner rather than later. So I'm very comfortable. I would support this draft. Thank you.
Could I just make one quick response?
Yep, so recognize Matthew.
So, Carmine, I appreciate those comments. I would just like on the situation that we have lived through for the last decade, the last 30 years with respect to money in politics, very directly disagree that whether or not this language is in Webster's dictionary or not, and whether humans and regular citizens can understand it and feel confident about it, that it will be interpreted the same way by the courts, is the same thing. And the simple fact is that whatever side of this issue you fall on, if you write words that are not specific and defined and say what they mean and mean what they say, we are in this situation because the courts have interpreted common language that people feel like makes sense in very different ways. And the way that the many words, and we've seen some comments in the chat, but influence in particular is worded, is you could see this being overly interpreted or very narrowly interpreted. And if the point of this is to define it very clearly, I just don't think this is sufficient.
Hi, this is Costas. Can I?
Yes, so we recognize Costas.
Thank you. So first of all, a few reactions. Matt, I appreciate your, your thoughts, but one could just as easily misinterpret or interpret things in perverse ways, even if they're very specific. So one of your suggestions has been to adopt the express advocacy terminology, which itself has been subject to interpretation and is not so clear cut, despite the court's attempts to define express advocacy. I don't know that that is a definition that has been agreed to by everyone. The use of magic words, tests, and things like that are all subject to interpretation and controversy. So I'm not so sure that moving in that direction gets us any closer to where we want to be. In general, I share Carmen's support of what we've come up with and have no concerns about influence or the current language of the two sections of the proposed amendment. But let me just, by way of bringing together the issues around artificial entities or juridical persons, a couple of us are, maybe ask two things. First of all, in section 2 of the proposed language, where we enable Congress and the states to differentiate between natural persons and corporations, could the court conceivably look at that and use that as a basis for for differentiating corporate rights more broadly or more generally, right? In other words, could you look at this if this were to be adopted and say, well, this amendment enables us to distinguish natural persons from corporations, so clearly they are not the same as natural born and citizen entities or persons, right? Secondly, so that's one question. Secondly, we've received a lot of input from the public and others about the concerns about not addressing very directly and specifically or incorporating the language around corporations not having inalienable rights in this draft. So I take that seriously, as well as our mandate. We have a rationale for thinking about that as a second amendment. But as I've been thinking about this and the inordinate pressure that we're getting, and as set forth in the mandate to explicitly say that corporations do not possess inalienable rights of natural born citizens, to me, that doesn't necessarily mean that the court could not look at that and say, well, yes, corporations do not have the same rights as natural born persons, but they still can have free speech rights, right? Just because we deny them the free speech that's accessible to natural-born citizens does not mean that the court can can basically deny corporations those rights on that basis unless we explicitly were to say that. So I'm not so sure the critics or even the mandate as it has been written will achieve the goal that I think is intended, which is to get corporations out of the business of spending unlimited sums in an uncoordinated fashion. So I'm not sure that even if the amendment were to say exactly what the mandate says it should say, that would necessarily solve the problem. So maybe I could just throw those two things out there for discussion and see if I'm on target or if I'm missing the mark here.
Hi, this is
Thank you,
Dominic.
Costas. Dominic, who likes to, are there other commissioners who want to continue the discussion?
Yeah, this is Dominic. I'd like to offer some thoughts.
We recognize Dominic.
Thanks. So I think first to the question about the word influence, I'm concerned that the more specific we make the language, the more opportunities there are for future entities that may want to avoid falling within the confines of whatever we're laying out here are going to have opportunities to find those loopholes. So if we say influence is A, B, C, and D, and it means you can't use these specific words, and some entity says, well, we used word E, and we did this way, so this doesn't apply to us. I think if we keep it more broad, it actually covers more of future possible scenarios. Regarding Costas' point, I definitely agree that I think there's some, in section 2, there's two concerns I have with section 2 of this amendment. The first would be that the power doesn't seem to be, as you said, it doesn't seem to be very specified, so that it could actually be interpreted in a way that does say, section 2 says that Congress has the power to distinguish between natural persons and corporations, including by, but not exclusively by, prohibiting such entities from raising money. So they could, Congress could pass a law saying corporations don't have Fourth Amendment rights because this section of the Constitution says that corporations can be distinguished because of section 2 of this amendment. The second point that's somewhat related to that, this is more of a technical point. I just wanted to ask if my fellow commissioners would be amenable to clarifying the language in section 2 to just say distinguish between natural persons and juridical persons or juridical entities. I think there's a possibility that by specifying types of juridical entities like corporations or unions, there may be an opening for a future court to distinguish between those types of juridical persons and say, for example, that corporations could spend money on influencing an election, but unions could not. So I think it's better if we just leave it as two separate categories, natural persons and juridical persons.
Thank you, Dominic. Greg, I noticed that Cheryl has joined through the Zoom link. Could you change her to join through the webinar link so that she has the same video and audio privileges as the rest of the commission?
I just did that a minute ago, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. And Cheryl, welcome to the call. We had a motion and a second, and we're discussing the what we're nicknaming Amendment Number 1. And you've seen this language before. And so I'm calling now for other commissioners to make comments and discussion.
Mr. Chair.
Recognize Jeff.
Thank you. And Novell Alexander joined as well. If you didn't recognize him, you're in the minutes, Novell. Welcome. So thank you for this thoughtful discussion. I wanted to say, I think, a few things, and I'll try to hit on Costas's question, and which was, I think, echoed by Dominic as well, and Matt's on influence. I guess four or five things, if you'll bear with me. One is on the process and the law and what meaning the ballot law that created this commission and this particular language. We've gotten a lot of comments, some of which have suggested that the law that created this commission requires us to do certain things, i.e. it requires us to do one amendment, or it requires us to say certain magic words that are to the satisfaction of some, complying with the language of the statute. I think what the law does is ask this commission to serve the public and the country as a whole, and that's what we have done. That's what we are doing. Will we get it perfect? No. That's why the amendment process is long and burdensome and takes 2/3 of Congress and ratification in 38 states. So perfection is not the goal, nor are the demands and preferences that any one of us has. And so I wanted to say that mainly to say I have no doubt that what this commission is doing is exactly what was set out as a mandate, and there is no required answer. There is our best judgment on whether it's one or two amendments or more amendments and what the language should be, and then the people in the Congress will decide whether we did a good job or a bad job, but that's our job. I also say it because I think there might have been a misunderstanding that this proposal is somehow a compromise, or it's weak, or it's somehow not strong enough because there's some calculation that, well, we wanted to get it ratified, so therefore we have to be weaker. And to me, I do not believe that. If we want to get it ratified, it needs to be constitutionally sound, it needs to be effective, and it needs to reflect the consensus of Americans about the right thing. And that is not a calculation or a compromise, it is a necessity. And when I say it may not be what I would want, well, that's true, but we don't live in the kingdom of Jeff, and we don't live even in the kingdom of Massachusetts. We live in the United States, which means we need to do what we on this commission have done, which is listen, learn, research, exactly what we're asked to do. And so to me, this language, while not perfect, is strong, is constitutional, is effective, and will do the job much better than some of the alternatives that have been proposed. And I want to spend a few minutes on saying why I think that. First, constitutional language is not a law, it's not statute, it's not policy. Nothing in the Constitution solves the immediate problems of the day. It tells us and gives us, as the people, some chance at solving them. So we're not writing the law that will govern what the limits are, what the money is. We're writing the law that will empower the people to do it forever, long after we're all gone. What the problems they will face and what the dangers they will face and what even the nature of money and the nature of communication, everything will be different someday than it is now. And this needs to last, as Matt said, till then. And so a few points on that. I believe that empowering Congress and the states to have the power to regulate and set reasonable limits is far stronger, far better than saying Congress and the states shall do that. And I know that's counterintuitive, so I want to just say why I think that is. Shall sounds like a stronger word, doesn't it, than may. However, it's come up a few times tonight. The problem we are trying to solve is that the judiciary is not well equipped to make political decisions. The judiciary is not well equipped to know how elections work, to know, exactly what's corruption and what isn't. And if we keep turning it over to the judiciary, we will not be solving this problem. Shall turns it over to the judiciary. May puts it in the hands of the people and instructs the judiciary to give some distance for these decisions to be judged by the people. The problem now isn't that we have just an imperfect system. The problem now is that the people don't have the power to enact laws to fix it. We don't have the power to have limits on money because we were told mistakenly in the view of Massachusetts and this commission, and that the First Amendment would be violated if we had limits on certain kinds of money. This amendment will change that, not by saying what the limits should be, but by giving us the power to make those judgments again as a people, and we'll get it better or worse depending on the state, the generation, but it'll be up to us. And that's a huge improvement over leaving it in the hands of lawyers and judges who did not do it well. They failed. So I think May and the language of Section 1 that puts this back in the hands of the people is a far better outcome for the future of this country. Point number 2 on sort of constitutional language I would share is that in my view, the Constitution has to have broad words to work. Due process, equal protection. What do any of those mean? The context of what they mean is our project is trying to govern ourselves as a republic. And so to me, that's why influence is like those terms.
We're getting a slight break in Jeff's audio.
Okay.
Okay.
You're back, Jeff.
My back, sorry. So to me, influence has more lasting, positive, strong effect, not because it answers all those questions, it won't, but it enables better answers than otherwise defining it in more legalistic terms that would make great sense in a statute. And that will be the point of contention. I have no doubt every time there'll be arguments, debates, hopefully among the people, less than the judiciary, about what is the right line to draw. The judiciary will have a role if that line is so drawn so badly that it infringes on anyone's rights. And that's where reasonable limits comes in. And now you could say, oh, reasonable, what does that mean? Well, that's what we have in the Fourth Amendment. And the courts have done okay, and sometimes really, really good at figuring out what's an unreasonable search, even though technology and everything keeps changing that problem. So I like the words in this. And then point number 3, we've gotten a lot of comment on that this somehow is weak about the mandate for corporations not having the rights of the people. I disagree. As one who does not believe that corporations have constitutional rights of the people, I again think that does not begin to answer the questions that this commission has to answer about how do you put that into constitutional language that works. We heard very interesting debate on this commission between commissioners like Professor Bowie, who believe if you say that, you're not actually going to do anything about the problem, because the court didn't actually say corporations have the rights of people, and they can get to the same place with the same outcomes with an amendment that says corporations don't have the rights of people as they did before the amendment. I'd actually rather not have an amendment that just takes us back to the courts saying, well, we didn't say corporations have the rights of people. We said the people who own corporations have rights, and therefore. So I think answering the question more specifically, like Section 2 does, with a specific application, is, but leaving it to forever, again, generation after generation, to make the judgments about where that line is and what are the best rules for juridical persons or corporations versus people, is a good way to do it. Is it perfect? No. Can it be improved? Probably. But it is not weak. And that brings me to Costas's point. I agree, actually, that this amendment would probably do everything that ought to be done. That Section 2, if I'm a judge and I get an amendment that has just been passed by Congress and 38 states have ratified, and the consensus of the American people is we screwed up as judges and the people just slapped us back, and the first time the word corporations ever appears in the Constitution is to say they can be distinguished from between natural persons, that is a very strong constitutional statement before a judge starts venturing out to create corporate rights in other contexts. And I think it may well be enough to get to those other applications that I also am troubled by, and have some were kind enough to quote my book back to us. I don't change a word of that book, but I also think Section 2 is a very, very good response. Now, with a second recommended amendment that said, well, what if we solved the money and politics problem? What about all those other problems that Professor Coates and others have outlined about corporate assertions of rights in other contexts besides the elections? Well, if there's good language, that I look forward to Representative Gentile's presentation of that, that would be a good recommendation, because that's our job as a commission, to say, not perfection, not what's going to be ratified necessarily, but what in our judgment is the right way to go if the American people wish to follow our recommendation. So I think I hit my main points. May is very strong, maybe, and I believe stronger than shall. This is strong on corporations, and that issue and that problem. Influence, I think, is a very sound word. It fully acknowledging Matt's concerns about where that could lead, but believing the rest of the amendment in the context will protect from undue overreach, if you will, that this amendment may have some concerns from some about whether that could happen. So I took too long, but that's what I have to say at this point. I do look forward. I'm not ready to vote. I'd like to hear what others think. Look forward to the discussion. So thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. So we've had a motion, it's been seconded, and we're in the discussion phase. Are there other commissioners who wish to participate in this phase of the discussion?
Hi, Bill, it's Costas again. I just want to add one thing to Jeff's comments. In response to, I think Noval brought this up. I thought you'd mentioned this, Jeff, but we very deliberately included corporations, unions, or other juridical persons in the language of Section 2, in part because expressly citing corporations, I mean, we want to do it anyway, but that's something that we believe, is important to lots of people, but people on the other side of that argument are wary about union involvement. And by mentioning both of those examples of juridical persons in this explicitly, we thought that it would be clear that we were trying to address both of these sources of influence, as well as any other types of juridical persons. But those two examples are highlighted very specifically, not so that they could be differentiated from other juridical persons, but so that it can be clear that this is among the types of entities that we are talking about here. Jeff, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's also the context of what we're trying to address. The McCain-Feingold law that the court struck down in Citizens United specifically applied to corporations and unions. And so I think the response was to say, okay, we want to make really clear that that was wrong, and that you can distinguish between corporations and unions and set parameters around those kind of entities in the elections that you wouldn't set around people or others. I will also add, I meant to say with Dominic's point, I think there actually does need to be some flexibility for distinguishing between different juridical persons potentially. And the reasons may be that there may be entities, as there are, like PACs or campaign or ballot committees. I wouldn't venture to know forever, for all time, whether some of those might technically be juridical persons, but that Congress and the states and the people would want to say those kind of juridical persons can spend money to influence elections. These kind of juridical persons are economic actors. They should stay in the economy so it doesn't overwhelm the political space. Making those judgments and distinctions actually is, I think, a good legislative and the function of the people about what juridical entities should be, if any, spending money in our elections. I don't think we can be confident that we know all of those answers, and that this language actually should be good. And even if some states, as actually happens sometimes now, allows certain money for unions versus corporations, those are different kinds of entities, and they're, global shareholder structures with very few humans actually involved in any of the shareholder structure, compared to a local electricians union with 100 people in it. If there's a different judgment about whether that should be an entity that can spend money in the elections in that state, I'm not sure I would come out with the perfect answer, and think this amendment actually allows that kind of flexibility, again, within the context of the whole Constitution and Equal Protection Clause and First Amendment and everything else that the courts will keep an eye on.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Costas. Before we invite the public to offer their participate in the discussion, are there other commissioners who want to participate in this phase of the discussion?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Naval, yes, Naval.
Sorry for my late arrival, but I'm here now. But I just, I wanted to kind of express some of the my ideas that what I said in the previous our previous meeting a couple weeks ago. That I think that this language, the proposed language, is kind of solid, and I'm in supportive of what's already written, and I just kind of wanted to reiterate that I kind of what I said last time, that I see the Constitution as kind of like a set of goal posts or guide posts, as you will. And it if you read it, mostly it's not very specific. It's very broad and general throughout most of it, and specific when it needs to be or where it needs to be. But I think that this topic, it's so broad, and it's so encompassing that I think that we're on the right track of trying to keep it as broad and as for future interpretations as possible. I think if we get into the nuts and bolts, and getting really specific, I actually think that could be counterproductive, for future jurists and people alike. And I think, going back to what Jeff was saying, that I think the spirit of the Constitution really it's to empower the people, and that's kind of where our goals and aims should be, is to eventually empower the people in future generations if they want to get specific and nitty gritty on certain things, that they are allowed to do that, and jurists and the judges and courts should be able to tailor-make whatever the guidelines that are set, that if this should go for or if this should pass as a constitutional amendment, it should give them as much wide latitude as possible. And also, I want to be able to, give people the idea that, this needs to pass. I would hope that, this would be the beginning of some foundation where, whether it's a constitutional convention or Congress decides to take this up, but I like for this work to not be so much in vain, and have at least a chance at seeing the light of day. And I think if we get too technical and specific that actually is another counterproductive thing. And I would hate to see that it gets torpedoed, for lack of a better term. You know, if as it's going through the ratification process, if it gets to that point. So I think we need to be overarching, but yet hitting the points that were established in the act that created this commission, but yet being mindful of, you know, the political parameters, if you say that, that's, you know, currently going on across the country, but yet enough that other people may want to take a bite of this apple and say that they can live with some of this language and get it ratified. So that's how I kind of seeing this whole process, and, you know, from 30,000 foot view. So so that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Naval. Is there any other commissioner that wants to participate in this phase of the discussion at this time?
I just have one more comment.
Chair recognizes Matt.
As we discussed a couple weeks ago, and building on Naval, one very specific point you made, and I don't want to misinterpret words that you said, but specifically around this should not disempower the individual. The mandate that we've been given is to empower individuals in our democracy. I've been primarily focused on hoping to address this issue with the proposed language in a productive manner through the words influence and the breadth or lack there, or breadth of the word influence. But I do think that another significant concern I have is the fact that this is others to influence. And the way that this amendment is crafted puts significant power in the bureaucracy of Congress to legislate around others, which includes natural born citizens of the United States of America, the individual citizens of the United States of America, and their right to spend money or participate in elections. And I don't know who will be in power next year or the year after or 50 years from now. And I'm very hesitant. The reason we have a Bill of Rights is because the original Constitution did not enshrine the powers of free speech and freedom of the press in the government. But James Madison said we should, for sake of clarity, clarify that. And we wrote a Bill of Rights, and thank goodness we did. And so I deeply believe in putting power back in the hands of the individual citizen. I think this amendment, as drafted by saying candidates for federal office and others to influence, directly goes to the heart of giving Congress more power to regulate individual citizens' choices as they choose to engage in the political process. It is exacerbated by the breadth of the word influence. And given that I know there's a very worthy debate about whether we should allow individuals to spend unlimited money themselves to influence the elections, and I have my own very strong opinions about that. I hope to address it through the breadth of the word influence. But those two words together are very, very challenging to me in the context of individual citizens and influence. And I just want to say that. I know we talked about it 2 weeks ago, but in the context of this more kind of wholesome conversation about this language.
Thank you, Matthew. Is there other commissioners who wish to participate in this phase of the discussion? We recognize Jay Marsden.
I just wanted to. My double over there. Me.
We're getting an echo, Jay.
An echo.
You are muted.
Is that better?
Still getting an echo.
My bad, I've muted one of them. Jay, are you there?
You're sounding very good now.
How's that better?
You are unmuted.
You're getting an echo. Give Jay a chance to catch up here.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yes.
Don't worry about it.
Go ahead, Jay. You have the floor. I'm not hearing Jay. Does anybody hear?
No.
Jay?
No.
We're not hearing you, Jay. I think you either got to be on the computer or on the phone, but not both. Okay, while Jay is working on his connectivity issues, let me ask the question, are there other commissioners that wish to participate in this phase of the discussion?
Could I just speak, Mr. Chairman, to Matt's?
We recognize Jeff.
Thank you. You know, I deeply respect Matt's thinking on this and the spirit in which he has enlarged the subject. I think and appreciate his work around influence as potentially addressing his concerns about the reach to individuals spending money. I just want to note for my sake, and I think most people, but I guess I can't say that, that's going to be up to the people if they ratify this. Part of the problem is the overwhelming power of capital including in individuals' hands, if they deploy that into a place where you don't actually have a right to make all your free choices. It's a space in elections where equal citizens have an equal right to speak, be heard, and to vote and be represented. And the judgment that I am convinced about is that one of the major ways the court has gone wrong that we need to fix is that in a republic, you cannot have an individual spend $700 billion, to just pick one example. Sorry, $700 million. 700, big difference, but still a lot of money. $700 million as a candidate. So I think we do have a right as the people to address that and say, no, there has to be some amount of spending that everyone has a right to do. What that is exactly will go up with inflation, but there's also a right of the people to say, no, you're overwhelming the democracy and you can't spend all that money you have. Just go spend it on anything else you want, cars, colleges, whatever you want, but you can't actually spend it in an election because that isn't how democracy works. So we may not be able to agree on that point, and I respect that. That's there's a certainly respectable view that any limit on an individual to spend their own money on their own campaign is a problem, but I don't agree, and I don't think I don't think that's how democracy is supposed to be. That you have to accept the fair, even-handed restraints, just like in a town meeting or all the many other places where we accept even-handed restraints so that the whole larger democracy can actually function. So we may not be able to reach agreement by wordsmithing around that if it's a real division in separate principles, even though we have overlap in other areas like corporate entities or what have you. So I just wanted to note that, respecting Matt's view, but maybe we won't be able to agree on that. And then the other point about others is that it's an intentional word to address the problem about independent expenditures and super PACs and things like that are a big part of the problem that the court created with its line of cases. And independent expenditures is too narrow a word that has meaning to us, but will have no meaning in 100 years. So it's simply a flexible kind of word, but not intended to be open-ended so that Congress can pick and choose among individuals. Some people have some limits, some other people don't. The Equal Protection Clause, this amendment, the Constitution will always prevent that. But it is intended, in my view, rightly intended, to reach individuals as well as other entities, but to make sure that we can have some level playing field kind of rules that allow democracy to function.
Yeah, and I would just very
We recognize Jay Marsden. Jay, are you back?
Sorry, Bill. Just
Yeah,
2
I
seconds.
fixed that problem for you. I apologize for that. No, just briefly, I wanted just to put a word of support in for Jeff's argument. I think he gave us a very rational explanation of the language. I want to just be cognizant of the fact that in some respects we could arguably wordsmith this forever, and I think that what's been proposed here captures, I think, the work that we've done, the spirit of what we're trying to do, and I just want to put a vote of support of Jeff's language. That's all.
Thank you, Jay. We recognize Matthew.
Yeah, thank you. So Jeff, I agree that maybe at the end of the day there's philosophical difference, but maybe there's not. And just to spend 20 seconds on it, on the first point, this is why I want to be more specific about the word influence. And I don't know, you've raised the example previously in our conversations around future advances in technology, an individual investing in certain technologies or not that influence elections. What do we know? What do we know how that will be interpreted in the future? I am cognizant this is a document that we are attempting to amend that has been interpreted in many different ways and should be interpreted in many different ways. I just think that word is too broad, which is how I've been trying to address the topic around inclusion of others, which, yes, I understand the intent is to get away from the idea of independent expenditures, but the word others very logically includes individual citizens in addition to independent expenditures, not just candidates for federal office. So that to me feels like a direct definition. And so I'm wrestling with those two words together. And I agree that we may be wrestling with them independently too, but together they cause me a lot of heartache in what we're putting into a document that was built around enshrining the rights of individuals as separate from, as a unique experiment in history to enshrine the rights of individuals as unique, and only limited versions of those rights are granted to government. And so this is the tension I have, fully being on board with the simple fact and the premise of this commission, that we need to limit the amount of financial impact on our elections, and that we can't have different entities, artificial entities and otherwise, impacting things in ways that are taking power away from our individual citizens.
If I might, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. We recognize Jeff.
So just to quickly close the, maybe not close if Matt wants.
You only get to close it if I just yeah. Good.
I do just want to note one quick point, which is that we are in complete agreement on the primacy of individual rights. I think it depends how you look at this. From my perspective, the violation of individual rights is happening overwhelmingly every day right now for millions and millions of Americans who have no voice and no real representation. That's the violation of individual rights. And the cause of it is an undue application of that doctrine to wealth as a way of exercising a right. Now, I do know that money is not speech, is not a satisfactory response. Money does have to facilitate speech in many instances, but that the individual right violation also, if you can look at it as what speech right or representation right or other right that Americans have, remains if most people don't have any money to amplify speech or to participate in Republican self-government. It becomes oligarchy. So, I think Section 1 tried to put some definition around what the goal is, but I just want to say we are
and Jeff, I would
agreement
say,
on individual rights. So
I would say darn right, and very specifically, right? An amendment to the Constitution, a 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution, cannot be an overreaction to a moment in time or a 50-year moment in time. It just can't be when the foundation of the document is enshrined in the unique rights of an individual. And I would just posit, as evidence of the primary campaign that we just went through, 2 individuals at least attempted to purchase this election, in my personal opinion, Michael Bloomberg and Tom Steyer, and failed miserably. And a person who directly focused on the individual small donor came within a hair's breadth of the nomination. So I'm not saying that will happen 2 years from now or 4 years from now, but at least, and I'm also not saying that is the same dynamic where overwhelming money comes into local elections, which I think is a very important issue. But the simple fact is that I don't want to have an overreaction to an issue in the Constitution that changes foundational rights in a future court that we don't understand how they will interpret these words, when actually the data we have at the national level points to people that tried to buy elections failed, and pretty miserably failed, versus folks that were driving small dollar donations, which says to me as a pseudo social scientist that there are other independent variables that are affecting how we elect people in this country, which is certainly outside with all of the respect to the comments that we have received, which are very well taken, certainly outside the mandate of this commission to figure out how to increase participation in our electoral process, something I'm very personally interested in. But I want to make sure that we do not overreact here as a country. I have full support for drawing a line in the sand of what needs to change, but I also want to draw on the data that we see in front of us.
Thank you, Matthew. We have met several members of the public have expressed the desire to participate in the discussion, but before we activate that part of the process, let me ask again, are there other members of the commission that wish to participate in this phase of the discussion at this time?
Hi, Bill. I have.
Mr. Chairman, I just have.
So I think Costas was first. Let's do, we recognize Costas.
Sure. I just want to underscore something Jeff raised and that came up in my comments, but also in response to a lot of the feedback that we've been getting specifically regarding the inclusion of artificial entities not possessing inalienable rights. We very well might decide as a commission to recommend a second amendment that addresses that issue directly. We may not. But I think even if we don't, it's important that, in my view anyway, Section 2 of this amendment, although it doesn't explicitly say that corporations do not possess rights of people, makes it very clear that corporate and other juridical persons' rights can be differentiated from natural persons' rights. So this goes quite a ways in achieving the spirit of what I think that part of the mandate tried to achieve. So for much of the criticism that we've received, people who have just flat out said, we can't endorse this amendment as written if it doesn't include this language. I think that would be shooting ourselves in the foot, and that would be, it would be a mistake because to some extent, at least within the context of election spending, we are saying that very directly in Section 2, that corporations are not natural persons and could potentially have different rights. And I think that, that was really the main spirit behind that. So I just wanted to raise that again, and hopefully that assuages some of the concerns that the critics have about whether or not we included that language. I mean, we grappled with this as a commission and as a subcommittee. This is not, we are very mindful of the mandate to address that issue. And for several reasons that we've tried to articulate, that is not so easy to do, but I think that this really does, it might be more subtle, but it makes that clear.
Thank you, Costas. We recognize Carmen. Carmen, you have the floor.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm content to move along. Thank you.
Thank you. Are we ready to move to the public? Any other
Yes, we
commissioners?
are. I'm sorry, go ahead, Bill.
Okay, so this is how it's going to work. Greg has been keeping track of individuals who have expressed the desire to share their perspective, and we're going to take them in the order in which people raise their hand. And I'm going to call upon Greg to give me the name of the first person. We'll open up the mic for that person. I will ask everybody in the public who is now participating in this discussion to limit yourself to 2 minutes. And the reason to do that is just to be able to keep forward progress. We have a certain amount of time and we have many more agenda items to discuss. So if you could make your points in 2 minutes, it would be much appreciated. Okay, and Greg, who's the first person?
The first one is Michael Bleiweiss. By the way, we currently have 8 people who've raised their hand.
Great. So Michael, you're on.
Thank you. I am Michael Bleiweiss from Methuen, Massachusetts, and I wish to dispute the concept of doing this through 2 amendments. You need to think of passing this amendment as being like killing a wasp. You got one shot, and then it comes after you and stings you. The corporations and moneyed interests are going to throw every weapon they have to prevent the amendment from passing. If we somehow manage to get a standalone campaign finance amendment passed, there is no way they will allow us a second bite at the apple to take away their constitutional rights too. Remember, this was all part of a key part of the long-term plan for corporations to hijack our government that was laid out in the 1970 Powell memo, a link to which I can send the commission if it hasn't already been. I'd also like to mention that preambles are meaningless and a waste of words. That's been proven many times by the Supreme Court. The most notable example being their Second Amendment decisions, where they've ruled that people have an absolute right to own all the firearms they want, regardless of the well-regulated militia provision of the Second Amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Who's next, Greg?
Next one is Stephen Brody.
Stephen, you're on. Stephen?
Stephen is muted right now.
Stephen, you have the floor.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. First, give me before. I want to thank Bill Kilmartin for acknowledging the message I sent yesterday. Thank you, Bill. And I want to say that any amendment must include that corporations are not people and money is not free speech. I feel this proposed amendment is too weak and too watered down and can be interpreted in many ways and not the way it was intended. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Do any other commissioners have questions for Stephen? Okay, and hearing none, who's next, Greg?
The next one is John Lamb.
John, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate you taking public input at this point, and I think that's created a very good process, and it's been a very good discussion. I'll try and be brief. I have one point of breadth and a couple that are more a strategy, I think. I feel like the amendment as written is all focused on candidates' elections and ballot processes. But if you look at the purpose as captured in the law that set up the commission, it includes protect the integrity and fairness of elections and government, prevent corruption, secure the right of all Americans to be represented and participate in self-government as equal citizens, protect freedom of speech, and ensure the constitutionality of sound regulation and operation of corporations and other economic entities by the people. So as we look at I sent a paper to you from Professor Salter that showed the corruption in the sugar industry and how wonderful a return that gives to the companies in that industry. But a lot of that is achieved by lobbying. It's achieved by spending between elections. And a lot of that effectively puts money in the hands of candidates one way and another, gives them benefits between elections, but isn't really election money and election spending. So I feel like the language needs to be broader to capture money in politics, money in government, not just money in elections and ballot measures. So that's one point. The second and third are really related to strategy. I feel like we need the strategy going forward to know exactly how the actual amendment should be designed at this point, because this won't be the final amendment. It's going to go through, nobody's going to just take this and put it in the Constitution. There's going to be a lot of other discussion before then. If we think of the purpose of this amendment now, I feel like its purpose is to draw more people in. It's to draw more support. It's to get a few...
John, we're at 2 minutes. Can you wrap up, please?
Yeah, get a few champions on board and to get things moving. So it needs to be compelling language that'll motivate ordinary people and speak to ordinary people. And the last point is the one of there's so much money in this that I feel as though it's very likely that corporations will try and fight it on constitutional grounds. And so it looks like the taking away corporate constitutional rights needs to be part of this. If it's not here, then they'll bifurcate the whole thing and maybe support this amendment, but then take the battle to constitutional rights again. So
Thank you, John. We're over time.
both need to go together, I feel. Thank you.
Thank you. Any commissioners have any questions for John? Greg, who's next?
The next one is Barry Rosenberg.
We recognize Barry. You got the floor.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. I would like to dispute Jeff's heart is in the right place, but I would like to dispute his concept of the use of may, and I'd like to dispute the concept of limiting the differentiation of artificial entities and real human beings to money. I feel that the decisions that are made are not made by the people. They are made by the courts without the presence of a language like shall, without a broader concept that it applies to everything and not just money. You are giving the courts the freedom to do the rulings that they have made since Citizens United. Citizens United is 10 years old, and we have had no movement nationally in defeating it. The people are for defeating it, but it hasn't happened on the legal front. You can't give the courts levity in this. May gives them levity. I lived through the civil rights movement, and until integration was forced down the throats of southern states fought it. If you give slack, the slack will be taken. They'll be taken by corporations. They'll be taken by special interests. The people do not make decisions in courts. The judges do. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. And commissioners have any questions for Barry? Okay, who's next, Greg?
Next is Ulysses Letner.
Ulysses, you're on.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, my name is Ulysses Letiner. I'm a resident of Somerville, Massachusetts. And yeah, I'm concerned, I'm not going to comment on the actual wording you have in this amendment, which I could, but that's really just my opinion. I'm really more concerned about the factual likely outcomes of trying to split the two goals of your commission into two separate amendments, which it looks to me like that's really what you're trying, you're heading in that direction now. And this particular amendment, which we've been talking so much about, it has a lot to say about the regulation of money in politics for influence. But the fact that it does not explicitly address corporate constitutional rights is hugely problematic to me, because several of the commissioners have made comments that suggest you think that it could have that as a side effect. It might lead to the courts, removing some of corporate artificial entities' constitutional rights, but it by no means is guaranteed to do that. You need, and to be guaranteed of doing that, you would need to have a more clear wording.
Ulysses, can you wrap up? You're over time.
Sorry. I just wanted to point out, I guess, in closing, that it's been 49 years since a meaningful amendment was ratified that was giving 18-year-olds the right to vote. More recently, we've had only one amendment, which was a human resources policy update regarding congressional salaries. And so the thought that you could break the goal of the commission into two separate amendments and actually expect both of them to be ratified in our lifetime, the evidence suggests that that cannot happen, and it will not.
Okay, thank you. And commissioners have any questions for Ulysses? Sorry to cut you off, but we need to move on. We have others. Who's next, Greg?
Robert Sarafkan.
Robert, you're on. Robert, you have the floor.
Thank you. I have a few points, but I believe I can state them briefly. First is taking issue with a couple of the premises that Representative Gentile took in explaining why two amendments were better. He said that most people were much more concerned with the issue of money in elections than with the issue of corporate use of constitutional rights. I did a lot of canvassing. I talked to a lot of people. And yes, get big money out of politics is a very easy phrase. But when you talk to people about corporations not being subject to laws for public health and safety, that gets their attention also. So I think the idea of opening with this amendment because it's easier to pass than the other, we're taking a fallback position as our opening position. And I think that's less, not more likely to get the result we want. The other point I want to make, and I'll keep it very brief because I'm outside my area of expertise, but I look at the strong differentiation between federal and state roles in the amendment, and I compare it to civil rights laws and other things where the federal government uses its authority to impact states that have lagged in the implementation. And I wonder if this just said Congress and the states, instead of saying Congress this and the states that there wouldn't be more pressure to have everybody implement these provisions. And the fact would be that—
Robert, can you wrap up your overtime, please?
I'll consider that wrapped.
Okay, thank you. Any commissioners have questions for Robert? Who's next, Greg?
The next one is Rob Whitney.
Rob? Rob, you have the floor.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Yeah, I know Jeff quite well. I'm the president of the Boston Lawyer Chapter for the American Constitution Society. We've been very supportive of this commission and the ballot measure specifically. I did put some proposed language in the chat as well, and really it's a focus on trying to get the amendment really lean and tight because I think that's its strength. The strength of the process is really dealing with Citizens United and how to get money out of the election process. That should be really the key focus. I'm very concerned about preamble language and sort of the subsequent language at the end of section 2, because I think that's where the courts are going to begin, conservative courts are going to begin trying to limit the purpose of the legislation, which is to limit money. I share Matt's concern about the word influence. And so what I had suggested maybe is just take it out entirely and using something such as, instead of influencing, just say, Congress shall have the power to regulate and set reasonable limits on the raising and spending of money in regard to federal elections, period. I mean, that's broad and it's strong, and you don't have to worry about any language interpreting what does influence mean, how would it be used to limit the power, things of that nature. So my general words would be try to make it lean, tight, and as powerful as possible on the core position, which is to limit money in elections. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob. Would you repeat? You had specific language. Would you say that language again?
Sure, I put it on the post as well. All I suggest is the section 1 should read, Congress shall have the power to regulate and set reasonable limits on the raising and spending of money in regard to federal elections. And then the second part would be about the states.
Thank you. Commissioners have any questions for Rob? Hearing none, we'll move on. Who's next, Greg?
The next one is Robert Sarafkan. No, we just did that. Clyde. Clydia Davenport.
Hi, Ms. Davenport, you're on. Ms. Davenport, you have the floor. Hello?
It says they're unmuted. I don't know why they're not speaking. Perhaps they're not on their end. Perhaps we should move on.
We can come back to Clydia later. Who's next?
Okay. Next is Sam Feldman.
Sam, you have the floor.
Hi, thank you. I'm just going to, I have a couple of points. I'm going to give them to you in order of how novel they are to you. First, one thing that I noticed in the language itself was that it included elections and ballot measures, but it did not include lobbying, which is an enormous problem of the way money actually influences laws, and as another caller pointed out, a big part of the mandate of the commission as well. I would suggest adding to that list the word laws, and I specifically say laws rather than a word like legislation, because there's a big jurisprudence on First Amendment law about what that means, interpreting it broadly to encompass rulemaking power, executive action, things like that, whereas legislation could be interpreted too narrowly. In terms of the preamble, the point that Michael was pointing out, I think that was a valid point. I think that the fact that the amendment starts with the word "to" helps. I think that it would help more if it started with something for the purpose of, or I don't remember the exact wording that I was thinking, but something that makes it very clear that this is the only reason that the regulatory power is there. You could even put that clause after has the reasonable power to regulate, et cetera, for the purpose of. I think that would make it more clear that that is actionable language rather than a preamble. And then to briefly address Matt's point and hopefully to assuage his concerns, I wanted to point out the Fourth Amendment, which says in relevant part, the right of the people to be secure against unreasonable searches shall not be violated. There it was not clear in the language what the word secure means, but it was very clear in the history of what was going on at the time, what kinds of things the writers of the Fourth Amendment were concerned about. And what they were concerned about specifically were people coming in and searching their property and seizing.
Sam, we're at time. Could you wrap up?
Sure. My point, which I said in an email to you also, is just that as technology evolved and circumstances changed with infrared cameras and helicopters, if they had written in exactly what they meant at the time by a word like secure, it would not have fit what they actually intended to encompass by it. When you have the purpose written there and you have the context of the time, it allows courts like the Supreme Court did in the 1970s to change the meaning of that word to encompass the original intention with new context.
Thank you. Any commissioners have questions for Sam? Okay, is Claudia back?
I'm going to try it again. Claudia?
Yeah, it might be a typo, it might be Claudia.
Claudia? Again, not responding.
Ms. Davenport, you have the floor. We recognize Ms. Davenport. We're not hearing you. Okay, let's move on. Greg, how many more do we have?
We have two more after her.
Okay.
Next one is David Rosenberg.
David, you have the floor. David, you're on mute. David, we're not hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'd like to appeal to the commissioners to honor the commitment that they made when applying to be members of the commission. The application form asks you or require you to check that you intend to comply with and advance the policy established by this act. And the application made clear by quoting section 1, paragraphs A and B, what the policy was. It was includes to affirm that artificial entities do not possess the inalienable constitutional rights of the people, and therefore compliance with what you said that you intend to comply with in advance would require you to propose an amendment that indeed affirms that artificial entities do not possess the inalienable constitutional rights of the people. That is point one. And point two is, since the wording that the commission ends up with will not be the final wording of an amendment, but rather will be a starting point for the people representing Massachusetts in discussions and negotiations with other people, that you ought to not pre-weaken the Massachusetts position, but you ought to go in strongly asserting what the people of the voters of Massachusetts asked for in overwhelmingly passing question 2. And it may
Thank
well
you, David. We're at time. Can you wrap up?
Yeah, so I guess the wrap up is, please strongly assert what the voters asked for, which is the affirmation that artificial entities do not possess the inalienable constitutional rights of the people. Thank you.
Thank you. Do any commissioners have questions for David? Who's next, Greg?
We have 2 more. Paul Lowenstein.
Paul, we recognize Paul. Paul, you have the floor.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to point out that the commission voted to endorse the We the People Act, the language of which is clear and unequivocal in terms of preserving constitutional rights for real people and requiring Congress to pass, to enact campaign finance restrictions that will get rid of the influence of big money in politics. And so I don't see why not propose or recommend language like the language in the bill that you endorse, which is, I might add, congruent and consistent with the language in the ballot question itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any commissioners have questions for Paul?
Well, this is Costas. I would just say that I don't see a tension. It is not intention with this proposed amendment to support the We the People Act and to advocate on behalf of it in Congress. I think that that's exactly what this amendment and the language we've proposed enables us or anyone else to do, is for Congress and the state legislatures to legislate on
Thank
this
you,
matter.
Costas. Other commissioners have questions for Paul? Hearing none, we'll move on. Who's next, Greg?
Nick G.
We recognize Nick.
Hi, thanks so much for taking my comment, which actually is in the form of a question. First of all, I just want to say how excited I am to hear how many folks on this call are energized and focused on this issue. That's really exciting to me, because I think that this thing is the whole ball game, and if we can get it right, we get a lot. I was hoping to ask a question of Jeff because he was speaking to this before. I was wondering if you might clarify, Jeff, why, with the language as proposed, we shouldn't be concerned that the Supreme Court might interpret that language in such a way that would preserve the status quo. I know that's a big question, but and I know you talked about it before, but something about your answer I didn't get it. I was hoping you could clarify.
Thank you, Nick. Jeff?
The chair's permission, I'll just very briefly say, and Nick, happy to follow up with me, and I can share more when we have more time. But bottom line, this, in my judgment, this language actually takes away the risk more, not eliminate, and I'll get to that in a second, of court interference with the people's intent, because it is by definition saying the people through Congress and the states have the space to make these judgments, and the courts have less of a role than they do right now. Not no role, but less of a role and more guidance in that role from the Constitution by way of the people about the relationship of money and speech and corporate entities. There is no guarantee. The 15th Amendment is very well written, and it took over 100 years and is still taking time to make the right to vote regardless of race, a reality. And that's part of, sadly, the deal that we have in America. That no, Brown versus Board of Education was 100 years after the Civil War. This stuff takes a long time. What we're trying to do is give us the power as people to do better. And reliance on unelected judges is, other than the rare Brown versus Board of Education, has proven to be a bad strategy. So I agree.
Thank you, Jeff. Greg, have we addressed all of the people who had raised their hand?
We could try Claudia one more time, but that's all that's left.
Okay, Claudia, you're on.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Hallelujah. I apologize. Is it possible to put the wording of the amendment up? Well, anyway, okay. I suggest a couple of changes that will make it grammatically better and more understandable. We say blah 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 blah. The reasonable limits on the raising and spending of money in federal elections by candidates and other natural persons. Same thing for the state. Raising and spending of money in state elections by candidates and other natural persons. In the at the bottom of appropriate legislation and may distinguish. Actually, I preferred the shall, but anyway, distinguish between natural persons and juridical persons, including but not limited to corporations, unions, and others you can put there. Prohibiting such entities, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So I think that would make it clearer and would accomplish what you have intended. By saying, for example, money by candidates for federal office and others, the court can say, and other offices. No, and other, we're talking about other natural persons. We're not talking about others, including corporations. So we're talking about the people who donate the money for the elections. So anyway, those are some suggestions that I have.
Thank you, Ms. Davenport. Commissioners have any questions for Claudia? Okay, we have a motion. It has been seconded. We've had discussion. Yes.
Just one other person, Barry, just raised his hand.
Have we done Barry already?
Yes, we have.
No, I think we need to move on. Sorry,
Okay.
Barry. We got 8 agenda items. We're on topic number 3. Okay, so we have a motion. The motion has been seconded. We've had discussion. The commission is ready to vote. I'm going to call the roll. Jeff, how do you vote on the motion? Jeff,
Can you restate the motion?
Yeah, please.
The motion is to approve the draft language that was shared in the previous meeting and at the beginning of this meeting. That's the motion that's been seconded and discussed.
Yeah. Aye.
Costas?
Aye.
Bopa?
She's muted.
Unmute.
Aye.
Dominic?
Aye.
Jay?
Aye.
Scott? I don't see Scott up there. Scott?
I don't
Come
think.
back to Scott. Matt?
No.
Carmen?
Aye.
Cheryl?
Aye.
Naval?
Aye.
Bill votes aye. Scott, back to you. I think perhaps Scott is
Scott's not
disconnected.
on.
Say again?
Scott's not on.
Yeah, he's disconnected. Okay, the motion has been voted and approved. Let us move on to the next topic on the agenda. which is the possibility of a Second Amendment. Carmen, you had done some work on this, and I know have a suggestion. Are you in a position where you could share that possession with the rest of the commission?
Sure. You know, recognizing that our mandate is also to to have an amendment which explicitly sets forth that corporations, juridical persons do not have the inalienable rights of people. We put together this, the subcommittee put together this amendment to answer that need. And I'm not going to say any more at this point. Thank you.
It would help if we could see the draft language.
Carmen, do you have it? And can you share your screen?
I don't have it in front of me. It's not, let's see.
I have it over here.
You have it there? Yeah.
Yeah.
Good, thank you.
Could people see that?
Yes.
Simple and to the point.
Do we have a motion to take a position in regards to the possibility of this, we're nicknaming amendment number 2?
I'll make a motion.
Do we have a
I'll
second?
second the motion.
Okay, discussion. And let's start with the members of the commission, and then we'll repeat the process to allow commentary by the public. So members of the commission, you're on.
So this is Costas. Thank you so much for this. You know, as I said in my comments earlier, I'm not so sure that we necessarily, but I'm not, you know, the spirit of the mandate that we were charged with. I'm wondering if we could revisit this to just say that corporations and other juridical persons shall only have the rights expressly granted to them by state and federal law. In other words, don't explicitly use the negative. Don't take anything from them by, you know, specifying that they do not possess constitutional rights of natural persons, but stipulate that they only have those rights that are expressly granted to them. Does that get us to the same place?
Another commissioner want to respond to the question by Costas? Okay, would another commissioner like to offer an opinion in regards to the motion for amendment number 2?
I mean, I guess my statement would build on Costas in the sense that I'm interested in his, I think his analysis is interesting. Frankly, the implications for this as an amendment where it's taking rights away, I'm not sure that I fully grasp and understand.
I mean,
and I think it's a pretty, it's building on Costas's, I think your core point, which are on the unintended consequences of something like this without thinking through it a lot more.
I hate to jump back in here, but I think I remember some discussion, maybe Jeff, you remember, but I think it was Wyoming law that phrased this a little bit differently. It basically said constitutional rights are only extended to natural persons or something like that, right? So instead of trying to strip somebody or something of rights, we could just make it clear that the constitutional rights apply only to individuals. or natural born, natural person.
Okay, the chair would like to participate in this discussion as well. I'd like to make a motion that we table this motion and that we appoint a working group to work on suggested wording for a straw man for amendment number 2 and report that working group, report back their wording at the next meeting of the commission. So I make that motion that we table this amendment at this time, refer it to a working group with the expectation the working group brings back to us proposed language at our next meeting. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second.
Discussion? Okay, all in favor? Bill says yes. Jeff?
Aye.
Costas?
Costas.
Costas?
Frozen.
I'll come back to Costas. Bopa?
Aye.
Dominic?
Gone.
Jay?
Aye.
Matt?
Aye.
Carmen?
Aye.
Cheryl?
Aye.
Noval?
Aye.
Okay, who would like to be on this working group?
I will, Mr. Chair.
Was that
Ms.
Noval?
Noble.
Who else?
I'll join
I'd be
it.
happy to be on the group.
Okay, that was Carmen. Was that Cheryl?
It was.
Okay. Others?
Bill, I'll join. Jay.
This Jay. Anybody else? Okay, so the motion has been made, seconded, discussed, and enacted that we will table the specific language for amendment number 2. We refer that to this working group with the expectation that this working group report back their recommendations at our next meeting. Let's move on to the next agenda item. The next agenda item is actually the report back of the working group on advancing a strategy for advancing the amendment. And you can see that on the screen. I happen to be showing it right now. So let me. In the interest of time, we're getting very short on time. I'm just going to walk you quickly through a 9-slide PowerPoint deck, which is the report of the working group on a suggested strategy for advancing the amendment. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. This was Carmen, myself, Scott, Jeff was on the working group. So people have this, and I'll walk you through it quickly, ask you to think about it, reflect upon it, and suggest that we discuss it in our next meeting. So perhaps a slide talking about the purpose of the strategy. The assumption is that we would have one strategy for 2 amendments. This would be, instead of 2 strategies for 2 amendments, it would be one strategy, the same strategy for both amendments. A reminder of our guiding principles. This is extracted from the report of December 31st. And these are the guiding principles that we all discussed, debated, and agreed upon in putting our December 31st report. So we thought the working group did that it would be appropriate to remind ourselves of our guiding principles. I'll spend a minute on this slide. It is our suggestion that in terms of a snapshot of what is the strategy on a single page, point number 1 is the strategy would be multidimensional. There'd be a part of it about engaging the political leadership in Massachusetts as well as elsewhere. There'd be a dimension about engaging other states. And there'd be about a dimension about engaging the public writ large, including public interest groups, the media, and etc. Point number 2 is that the strategy should be driven by the citizens. It is nonpartisan. It is not a conservative or a liberal philosophic approach. It is not a Republican or a Democrat political approach. Instead, it's driven by the people. It's grassroots in Massachusetts and indeed across the states. The third portion of the recommendation, recommended strategy, is that the strategy be bifurcated, that is 2 parts. One route is going through Congress and press that Congress to act, and at the same time go through the states for a limited convention. Either route accomplishes the objective. And the final point that you see on this slide is to have a time frame where the series of activities can be orchestrated and coordinated, and we've got a suggested time frame here. So moving on, what you see on slides 7, 8, and 9 is further detail of what was summarized on slide 6. On the dimension of engaging political leadership, you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 suggested activities. You can read those and give us feedback, between the time of now and the next meeting. But it is the recommendation of the work group that all of these activities have merit, and we propose them in a work plan Gantt chart type approach in a near-term, mid-term, or longer-term perspective. In regards to engaging other states, you see 2 specific activities here. Again, with proposed timeframes. And in regards to the third dimension about engaging the public writ large, you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 specific activities also set forth in a time frame. I'm going to call upon other members of the working group to add further commentary and elaboration. Carmen, Scott, Jeff, you want to weigh in here? Don't be shy. Go ahead, Jeff.
So I think it's an excellent summary, Bill. Thank you, and reflects accurately what we want to do to really accelerate this thing. I emphasize on the 2 amendments approach. In my view, it's actually historically true that you don't get just one bite at the apple, that when moments come for amendments, you get, if the country determines that it's necessary, 3 or 4 amendments. Almost all of our amendments came in bunches like that, from the Bill of Rights all the way to the period between 1963 and 1971, when we did 4 amendments. So this strategy is really important because the country gets the appetite for amendments when all the chips are down and everything seems to be falling apart. And I'm not saying that's where we are right now, but I think we're in a period of time, much like those other periods of time when we did amendments. And if we execute this strategy and help, of course, the country execute a strategy like this, we will be able to fix a lot of things. And the sort of, so I think this is an excellent starting point. But of course, it's something that will evolve, and there'll be lots of organic ways that people will want to accelerate this moment in American history when we kind of renew our principles and our commitment to them. So I think it's a great start. So thank you, Bill, for the presenting it so clearly and well in that deck.
Well, thanks, Jeff. Carmen, you want to weigh in?
I think there are people in every state of our country that embrace this idea of 28th Amendment to stop the corruption of money in politics, and realize that also realize that corporations and other juridical entities ought not have the ability to corrupt our elections, as they have since Citizens United came down. And many hands lighten the load. I think we're going to find a lot of hands throughout the country to team up with and move this forward. And this plan, I think, would go towards achieving that and bring people together. So thank you, Bill.
Any initial reaction from other members of the commission? Okay, hearing none, and knowing that we're getting close to 8 o'clock, I suggest that, this be on the agenda for further discussion in action at our next meeting. What I'd like to do right now is actually move to that topic of picking a time for our next meeting, where I believe we have at least 2 agenda items. One would be further discussion of amendment number 2. And second would be further discussion about a strategy for advancing the amendment. So if it's agreeable to the commissioners, and Cheryl, you're pretty good at this, I'd ask folks to pull out their calendar and just to get the ball rolling, might I suggest 2 weeks from today, which would be Tuesday, May 26th, 6 o'clock for our next call.
Mr.
I don't
Chairman,
have any dinner plans out at restaurants. So.
Did you say May 26th?
Is that too soon? Is that too soon?
Labor Day? Oh, no.
that date's fine with me, but as far as dinner is concerned, like 6 to 7 is a great time for actually having dinner. So I'm wondering if we might, consider meeting 6:30 to 8:30 or 7 to 9 rather than starting at 6.
What day is that on?
Tuesday, the 26th.
Tuesday, May 26th.
Oh.
It's the day after Memorial Day, so in case anybody wants to make sure they have gas in their tank, let's be cognizant of that, depending on how, Carmine seems to have more gas than all of us, so if he wants to go later, that's great, but let's just build that into the mix.
Or would you consider during the day at all?
Do mornings work for people?
What time of day, Bopa, would you suggest?
It really doesn't matter. I mean, it's easier during the day as opposed to around dinner time. So it could be like, 10 or 11.
Yeah, I could do 10 to 12.
I could do 10 to 12 on the 26th.
Just to flag, not to be a downer, but yeah, I'm from like 4:30 a.m. until about 7 p.m. every day. I'm pretty back to back.
Yeah, and I think I agree, Matt. I think people that have full-time day jobs, might be. I know it's inconvenient, but the 6 to 8 seems to be the least inconvenient.
Yeah. I guess we better go with it.
Cheryl, can you send out a note, May 26th, at 6:30 to 8:30? Is that okay?
Yep.
That's good.
I have a standing 7:30 meeting, but I'll see if I can move it, but we'll go with it. 6:30 to 8:30. Is that what works for folk?
Okay.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
So,
Greg, can you make sure that Costas is readmitted to the call?
I'm doing it right now.
Okay.
All right, April 26th, Tuesday, April 26th, 6 to 8.
May 26th.
hey, Sarah,
I mean, May. May. Not only do I not know what day it is, I don't know what month it is.
Okay, so let's move on. Next item on the agenda, the last item before we adjourn, is any other public testimony or public comment. Greg, do we have members of the public to make further testimony?
We're confused. There were 2 Barrys, and so if the other Barry would like to speak, I'll let him speak now.
Barry, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. It was Jeff who spoke earlier about the may versus shall on that amendment, the first amendment that you put up. And I would like to ask him or anyone else who can answer, what makes you think that Congress, not being required to make these changes, will ever make these changes, considering that they never have and have no reason to?
So thanks, Barry. It's certainly a reasonable question, and what we're all trying to do is, so the question for whatever comes out of this is, how are we able as a country to more effectively make the kind of rules that we think are more effective for democracy? And the question that is posed by shall versus may is who's going to make them do it if they don't. Shall's answer is the judges will make them do it. Shall doesn't make them do it. Shall says, well, if they don't do it, or if they don't do it right, or if they don't do it how I want to do it, I can sue them. And if we use shall, in my view, we are creating not democracy, not a republic. We're creating a government of lawyers and judges who will litigate every local, state, and federal law forever about whether they met the requirement of shall. The may or shall have the power to is what is used in the Constitution of government. Taxes, war, peace, virtually everything that the Constitution says government is supposed to do uses shall have the power to, except for rules of implementation like, tax bills shall come out of the House first. It doesn't say what that tax bill should be. So I think it's a better formulation to achieve what we're trying to achieve. Will it mean that they'll do it? No, but neither will shall mean that they'll do it. I think who will make them do it in the end has to be the voters and the people, or it won't get done no matter what the words say. And so who ultimately has the authority in a democracy or a republic? The people should, not lawyers and judges. And I think we just have a much better likelihood over the long haul of getting better results if we do it that way.
Thank you, Jeff. Greg, are there other people who have raised their hand for public testimony?
There are no other people.
Bill, I just want to add just one thing to what to Jeff's response to Barry, which is to say that, I don't think it is the case that Congress had shirked its responsibility to legislate these issues. They had certainly, and there were laws on the books preventing corporations and others from getting involved in campaign funding for 100 years before the court rendered its interpretation in Citizens United. So I don't think it's fair to suggest that that Congress had not, or the states had not legislated on this issue. They had, and I think that they would again, given the power to do so.
Thank you, Costas. Okay, the chair would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Do we have a second?
Second. Any
objection? Well, thank you, everybody. I think it was a long meeting, but a productive meeting. Like I said at the beginning, it's been a year since we started this journey together. I would hope that over the time frame between now and the end of June, we can be in a position where we can deliver our second report and be in a position of executing a strategy, advancing the amendment, or amendments, I should say. Any other questions or comments before we adjourn? All right, everybody, thanks to the public, and please be healthy and be safe. Thanks again, Greg Wander.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Greg, for doing this.
Bye. Good night.
Bye.
Good night.